For now.
All right, we are live. Oh my gosh. Okay. Hello,
Hello.
everybody. Hello, Jenny.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here. So to get us all situated, everyone, my name is Jodi-Ann Burey. I'm a speaker. I'm a writer who works at the intersections of race, culture, and health equity. I am here on behalf of One Kin, one of my favorite organizations, companies that's around right now. It's a mission-driven tech company that creates tech solutions to help small businesses and entrepreneurs gain more visibility and grow. And so that also includes a curated online marketplace for brands, authors, creatives, all folks of color. And with One Kin, I've been hosting these author chats in my lit lounge. I have a curated book list on the One Kin site. And so you'll find in the chats links to get all these books. And I had to have Four Treasures of the Sky on the curated list for this go round. And so I am here with author Tinghui Zhang, who wrote this incredible novel. Truly, I could not put it down. And so we're going to chat about all things writing process, craft, writing life, some of the themes and characters from this incredible book. Jenny, thank you so much for being here.
Yay, thank you so much for having me. I know we've talked before, so I'm just really excited to chat more.
Oh yeah, like I don't know if y'all know this, but I purely do this just so I can have new friends and to Jenny is going to be a friend of mine from now on. Makes me feel so good. I'm calling from Seattle. Where are you calling from, Jenny?
I am in Austin, Texas. So right now the sun is truly high in the sky and slowly making its way down, but we've got a while.
Okay, great. I'm in Seattle. As I said, it's overcast as per Seattle is around this time of year. And so I'm excited to just kind of cool down a little bit because it's been quite a summer. So I just want to ground us a little bit, and I'm going to have you do this work because I don't want to be responsible for sharing information that should not be shared about this book at this time. So I want you to do that work. But could you just summarize Four Treasures of the Sky for people who are watching who haven't had the chance to read it yet?
Yes. Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I've done this, so let's see how it goes. So Four Treasures of the Sky is it's about a young girl, a 13-year-old girl named Daiyu, who is kidnapped from her home in China and shipped across the ocean in a bucket of coal and in a brothel in San Francisco, Chinatown, and ends up making her way across the west to Idaho. And from there, trying to get back home to China. And this is all happening in the 1880s, against the backdrop of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So not only is she dealing with just the wear and tear of the environment, the weather, the time, but she's also dealing with the anti-Chinese sentiments of the time from the people and the legislation.
And it's interesting that you talk about like the history that surrounds the events of this main character, Daiyu, and kind of how she sits within this historical context. And so would you count Four Treasures of the Sky as a work of historical fiction? Does that feel weird to call it that?
I know it is historical fiction, like by definition it is, but in my mind, it still feels kind of odd. Even when I see it in the historical fiction section of a bookstore, it feels odd because I've never written historical fiction before, and I've actually never had an interest in doing it. So for it to now just be so categorically it's an odd feeling for me, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And so I don't know if I knew that it was historical fiction when I went into it, but I have this weird habit these days of I read the acknowledgement section before I actually read the book.
Yeah.
And then you have an author's note. And so I read the author's note, the acknowledgements, and then I actually read the book. And so I went into it knowing that the main impetus behind this story is this a story that your father told you about how he happened upon like a Chinese hanging tree, and the story about these 5 Chinese men around that time who were lynched in Pierce, Idaho. And so that was like the nugget of information that your father shared. And it was just like, okay, go. Write me a story. Write me a story,
Yeah.
Jenny. Just whip me up a piece of historical fiction.
It must be so easy. Yes, that is exactly it.
It's so weird because like I knew, okay, cool, this is the inspiration behind this. But as I'm going through the pages, I kind of forgot that that happens, right? And there's this one quotation that I cannot get unstuck from is in the book you say, I think a number of times you repeat this idea around, as in calligraphy as in life, we do not retouch strokes. What is done is done. Right. And I'm like holding onto it the whole time because it's like I'm so connected to these characters. I'm so connected to the story that I keep trying to will a different ending. But I'm like, what is done is done. And so can I look at these characters and look at the story for who they are, like the richness of who they are, regardless of what I know will happen to them. And I'm curious, as a writer's, from the writing perspective, knowing the ending, quote unquote, of the story, can you speak to the evolution of like how you imagined the lives of these 5, I think still anonymous men who were hung?
Yeah. So yeah, for folks who don't know, the story of the kind of genesis of 4 Treasures comes from my dad driving around in Idaho, finding this historical marker that talked about, these 5 Chinese men were hanged in Idaho in 1885. And I always knew that that was going to be something that I wanted to kind of end up at, because that was one of the questions of the book for me, especially when I first started writing it. That was the question of the book for me. So what I envisioned was, let me explore who these 5 Chinese men were. And I thought I was going to do a whole, like everyone has their own chapter. We follow their narratives throughout. But as I was kind of working my way backward from that and doing research around, how are Chinese people getting to America during a time when they weren't legally allowed to come over, I found research talking about how they would smuggle girls and women over in buckets of coal or crates of china to end up in the brothels in Chinatown in San Francisco. And so it was almost like that became my new starting point in the creation of the character of Daiyu, and everything else kind of came off of her, still knowing that there would be an eventual conclusion where we end up at a possible hanging, because I'm not trying to spoil things. But I think tracing the lives of each of these 5 Chinese people came from me focusing on this one character's journey and connecting her with the people she meets along the way who may or may not be involved with the hanging.
Yeah. And I think that's important too, because you don't, even in the information that you're sharing, is just like, you don't know, as the reader, you really don't know what is going to happen, like in terms of who these people are. And you just, there are so many points in the story that you forget. Like, at least for me, like I just kind of forgot. You're so entranced on this, little girl's journey, like right through this process. And so I'm actually curious, like how your dad thought the book turned out. Did he read it?
He did. He read it via audiobook. So yeah. He listened to it. And then once he finished, he told me it was good, but I still have some questions, which I will take it. I'm happy with that, because ultimately, like, I think he's more happy that something he told me had import enough to kind of engender this entire piece of art.
I love that. I love that. So the main character, her name is Daiyu, and I want to get a little bit into the name and kind of the events around her. But When I was preparing for this, I read an article that you wrote for LitHub about how watching the men's figure skating in the Olympics kind of helped you fall back in love with writing. And I read that and it was so emotional for me. I was actually crying a little bit towards I don't know why. I'm in an emotional state. I don't know why, but I want to read this quotation that you have in that piece. So you say, every writer has different reasons for why they write. Here are mine. I wrote to keep myself company. I wrote to make myself feel moved. Most of all, I wrote because I was trying to make sense of the world and of myself. I realized this early on. It was a joy to be able to tell stories that came from inside myself. And so when I read that, I thought about Daiyu and Lin Daiyu's relationship, right? And in the story, there's this character, Lin Daiyu, who often physically is coming inside of Daiyu, the main character, and out of, right? And so I'm curious if you can share a little bit about the origin story, Lin Daiyu, for people who are not familiar with it, and that relationship between this whole other being coming from outside or inside of our main character.
Yeah, I love this question. And thank you for reading that piece. I also cried while I was writing. So Lin Daiyu is a character from a very real Chinese classic novel. There are 4 kind of great classical novels of China, and this is one of them. It's called Hong Long Meng, or Dream of the Red Chamber. And Lin Daiyu, her character in that book, is one who is very sensitive. She is very sick from a young age. She has consumption, which kind of follows her throughout her entire life, and she ends up dying from it. She's also a poet, the best poet of her time, at least in her neighborhood. And she's also kind of involved in a very tragic love story where she's in love with her cousin, but he ends up marrying someone else who he thinks is her, but is not her, due to these family politics. And so she ends up dying at the end from both consumption and heartbreak. So in 4 Treasures of the Sky, my main character, Daiyu, is named after Lin Daiyu. And from the very beginning, Daiyu, one of her core questions is everything bad that happens to me in my life, such as her parents disappearing when she's very young and her being sent to the city all alone and then getting kidnapped, is all of that because I am named after this tragic figure who has a tragic end? Is everything written out for me, and is it always going to be immersed in tragedy? So that from the very beginning, we understand like Daiyu kind of hates her name, wants to get away from it, wants to get away from this perceived fate that she has, but does not know how. And eventually Lin Daiyu kind of, as you mentioned, she manifests as, some could say she's like a ghost, others could say she's maybe part of Daiyu's imagination, but she ends up kind of appearing during times when Daiyu is in the utmost trouble. For example, when she's floating across the ocean in this bucket of coal, when she's at the brothel and kind of about to take her first customer. So I think what I was trying to do was, one, give her kind of a tool and a resource and a companion for dealing with all of these difficult times. But also, I think it started becoming a symbol of what she wanted versus what she should do or thought she should do. Because another question that comes up for her as we get further along in the book is, what is the right thing to do? Should I stay in America and kind of help fight against the anti-Chinese sentiments of the time, or do I kind of follow my heart and go back to China and go back home? And Lin Daiyu becomes a manifestation of this childlike desire to return home, and to return to like childhood and being a child versus the growing up of it all and taking ownership and responsibility. So that's kind of how I came to understand it as I was writing it.
Yeah. So much is swirling in my head around that, right? Because it's like, yeah, what is the right thing? And like which version of our, like different versions of who we are have different answers to that. And so who do you listen to, right? And then also knowing that Daiyu and Lin Daiyu are in some version of reality the same person, right?
Exactly.
I like to do a reading of this where Lin Daiyu is real.
Yeah.
I believe Lin Daiyu is real, and I'm curious too. Like even just getting outside of the characters just for a little bit, because what's coming up for me is I have personified parts of me that arise when I'm in a crisis. I have Frances, who I've named as my depression. Frances is a bitch, I will tell you, but I lose so much weight every time Frances is around. So it's like, I don't know how I feel about that. And then I have Francine, who I'm writing a book right now. She shows up all the time. Anytime I want to, she's like my self-doubt voice, right? And she's like, you can't do this, very negative. And so I've been trying to manifest this other version that I'm calling like JB, which is the version of me that like fights for myself and like advocates for myself. And I'm just like, I don't need to talk to Francine right now. JB will talk to her, and then I can just like kind of get to writing. So
Yes.
When you're writing, do you have these different versions of you that have to show up in order to do this work?
Oh my gosh. I love that you assign roles. I love that. I think for me, I am just constantly in that state of like negative self-talk, and I don't believe in this. I'm not doing a good job. It's not good. And I don't know what compels me to like not listen to it, because I do listen to it every single day. But I think ultimately where the like the voice of reason, or maybe the self-love voice, comes in is, you know, by reading other people, and especially by listening to other people who have gone through that same hardship, because I realize like every author feels that to some extent. Um, and yeah, for me, it's just I have to find solace in someone else's work to remind me that I too can kind of figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you reading besides the research for this, and we'll get into that, but
Mhm.
what's so I'm writing my book, right? And then I was like, okay, I have to
Yeah.
read this book for this conversation. And so I'm reading it, and as I'm reading your work, I'm getting so inspired. I don't know what it is, because it's not like we're writing about the same things or even in the same genre, but it just propelled my work in some way. I'm curious if you had that, like the people that you were reading for fun or inspiration, or just because as you were writing this book, outside of the
Yes.
work and the research of it.
Yes. The one I always say is Alexander Chee's Edinburgh. Subject matter is completely different, but it does also feature a kind of 13-year-old or 11-year-old narrator. But that book I just had on my desk, and every day before writing, I would read 1 or 2 pages from it. And it was kind of what you're talking about. I read it because it made me feel inspired, not like I'm inspired by this book, but I was so inspired by how beautiful the language was, and how precise and intimate the writing was. And it inspired me to kind of try to reach any sort of level of that with my own work. So yeah, I think some people call it like a totem, a writing totem. That book was it for me.
Yeah. I love that you said that, because your writing is so clear. Like it has such a beautiful clarity to it. It also has a wonderful melody to it. And I was just like really soaking that in, and I think gave me permissions, because sometimes I try to write, I think my style is melodious, and then I get self-conscious because I realize that my sentences start to rhyme. And I'm like, girl, you're not writing slam poetry. Like, but as I was reading yours, like it had such a melody and a rhythm to it that was just very inspiring. And I think that's a good place if we can hear a little bit from you from the book. Because I want to also go back a little bit deeper into Daiyu and thinking about like how despite this lack of control that she had of the events surrounding her, like throughout the book, right? She is finding these ways to ground herself and like ground her agency. And so I want to, if you could read a little bit for those who are reading along, page 33 for the US hardcover edition of this. So we can hear a little bit of that, your writing style, the voice, and also I want to get a bit at Daiyu's own agency and how she's been holding on to that. So
okay, 33 to end of 34 or 35?
If the spirit moves you after 34, feel free. But we'll start with that first section and tell me. I mean, you go with how you feels right for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I began at once. In the courtyard, with a long birch branch in hand, I traced over the characters in the stone tiles, waving and flicking the branch as if I could conjure something from the earth. It felt silly, and I knew what it must have looked like to an outsider. A girlish-looking boy, a boyish-looking girl, playwriting and thinking he or she could be brave. The branch was foreign in my hand, the movements awkward. When class finished for the day and the students exited, I did not have enough time to hide what I had been doing. They found me scratching at the tiles with my branch and began laughing, pointing to the stick dangling from my untrained hand. I dropped the branch and ran back inside, searching for the broom, biting my lip and furious with myself. The Daiyu of a few months ago, the one who still had a grandmother at her side and a warm bed that was all hers, would have let the dream of mastering calligraphy rest. Trying hard at something and being scoffed at for it had never been part of that Daiyu's understanding. Something was happening to me, had been happening from the moment my grandmother sent me away on the cart to Jifu. I was ravenous for what calligraphy might bring me, and just as I knew I would never be a city man's wife, I also knew that calligraphy must be in my future. It would not be easy. It was just as Master Wang said. I had to practice. My first few days in Jufu had prepared me for this moment. Every store owner who had turned me away, every disgusted eye I defiantly faced, was a stone given to me, until eventually I had enough stones to build a fortress around myself. Let their scoffs come, I thought that night. At least I have my fortress, and it is impenetrable. The next afternoon, after my chores were complete, I was back in the courtyard, birch branch in hand. The day was cooler than usual, and the windows were open. Master Wang's voice floated through, and I let it envelop me, guiding my hand through the air. Look closer, it said. Your calligraphy will reveal much about you. From one glance at what you have written, I can determine your emotions and your spirit. I can gauge your discipline and identify your style. There are many more secrets your writing will uncover, and you will meet them when the time is right. I pocketed every word. This knowledge was precious to me, my way forward into the world. I never had a formal education, but under Master Wang's tutelage, I could feel myself becoming the person I thought I wanted to be. That person was someone strong and noble like my father, someone good-hearted and skilled like my mother, someone who could care for things with a gentle judiciousness like my grandmother. If I could become that person, I thought, then I would at least remain close to them, even if they were no longer near. And, I thought, none of those things involved Lin Daiyu or her story. The day came when I no longer needed to trace the stone tiles in order to write. Instead, I turned my gaze upward, letting the characters appear before me, thick and muscular and straight, just like the ones inside Master Wang's school. I carved and whipped my hand through the air until the characters could fill up the sky. They were inviting me to take hold of them, to mold them out of nothing. Or, perhaps, to mold them out of myself. I'll stop there.
Okay. So good. I love this section because, you know, she's at a very fragile time, right? At this phase in the book. And it's also very early in the book. And I think for me, it's where she's getting a sense of, okay, this is who I can be, right?
Mhm.
This is what I want for my future. And I think it's one of the first times since things started shifting in her life that, at least as a reader, I saw her thinking about herself in the future.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if, like, as you reread that piece of it, kind of what it conjured for you around Daiyu and how she started stepping into her own agency.
Yeah, I think this was one of the first moments when I don't know if it's in this section. Ah, it is. Okay. But this is one of the first moments where she meets resistance to kind of a yearning that she has or something that she wants to do, which is the other students laugh at her for trying to practice something. And rereading it, I don't know, I felt so proud of her all of a sudden because, so many things happen to her later on in the book where it's a very obvious hardship that she has to attempt to overcome. And I think this is one of the first moments for her where she meets that resistance and says, no, I'm going to overcome it because I want to.
Yeah, I love that too. And I wrote in the margins that section where she talks about building a fortress around
Mm-hmm.
herself, like the ways that you harden yourself to the
Yeah.
world when those things start to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started, in my own life, have hardened in a lot of different ways. But what's so comforting is that she is not hardened to herself, right?
Mm-hmm.
She still has this grounding in a sense of beauty and what could be possible for her, and grounding in her family as well. Um, and so, is there anything you want to say on that? Because I have another question related to this.
I would just add on, yeah, I agree with you. And I think that comes from her background in the arts, whether it's gardening or the tapestry weaving that she learns from her mom, or like the appreciation for calligraphy and the letters that she learns at this school. And maybe I was making a commentary on the important role that art plays in our life, but I do think it has a way of keeping you soft, not in a weak way, but in a just like a tender, gentle, I'm porous way.
No, I absolutely felt that. And I think there's this connection to, it's not in this section but plays throughout the book, this recurring motif about like being good with your hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because as you're talking about the tapestry, her parents are artists, her grandmother's a gardener, she's in this calligraphy school. And so yeah, she's working with her hands and has this artistic sense of beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Even later in the book, there's a character who also works with his hands, right, as a violinist.
Mm-hmm.
And so to see the hands as this place of beauty and strength and grounding, right, but also your hands as a means for survival, right, and for some of the characters later in the book was the site of punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so as the reader, I can see these, motifs throughout the book. I see these themes recurring. But I'm curious for you as the writer, at what point do those motifs kind of show up in the process of developing the story? Like, is it beforehand? You're like, okay, beauty, softness, hands, got it. Is it throughout? Is it after, a combination of all three? Like, how do you weave that so beautifully
Mm-hmm.
throughout all these different sections of the story?
Thank you. I don't think I ever went into it thinking, okay, hands are going to be a thing that just reoccur and I'm going to use them as a symbol for something else. But I do think they kind of organically, like I would get to a point and the hands would make sense to bring in. And it wasn't because I was thinking hard about like, oh, how can I connect this to something I've mentioned in the past? It was like the character almost guiding it. And same thing where she notices this other character, his name is Nelson. She notices his hands first, and that's kind of what arrests her about him. That was completely unintentional. I did not, I was not trying to connect things, but I think if I were writing it, which I was writing it from Daiyu's perspective, that made sense for her character at the time because it's a part of her character to notice the hands at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And so into the hands too, again, this part that you just read, she's at a calligraphy school. And calligraphy plays a big role in like how she grounds herself. I think probably because of these reflections that she's having right now, right? Like connecting all these things. And so I know that you are not a calligrapher, right?
Right,
And
right,
so
right.
I want to see how you in the writing of it navigated having calligraphy be such an integral part of the story and just kind of building in the kind of facts and metaphors around calligraphy in your storytelling. But also, I'm very curious because for those who haven't been able to open the book yet, the characters, like the actual characters, are in the text, right?
Yeah.
And we are so far from the days where I'm sure you've seen this when our writers are writing in English, but the characters speak other languages. Those other languages are always italicized. Like we are so far from that.
Right.
And Jenny, you're just like, no, I want actual characters in this thing. Like, how do you even navigate that with the design of it and working with the publisher and all of that? So if you can speak to like building it into the actual story and the work of doing that, like from a craft perspective, and then this like business side of writing, which is now you need to get Flatiron to like get an artist and draft these up in the text.
Yeah, yeah. So the calligraphy aspect, it was kind of similar to how I happened upon including Lin Daiyu as, you know, either a real or imagined figure in Daiyu's journey. I figured I need to give her something to hold on to as she's making her way through this journey, which is going to be very difficult. I don't think she can do it alone. She needs some sort of like grounding in terms of philosophy or morality. And calligraphy was kind of just the first thing that came to me. I felt somewhat close to it because my grandfather has written it in the past, and he actually is the one. She kind of talks about this in the book, but he used to rest his hands on his knees and you could see his finger moving on his leg, and it was because he was writing out characters or practicing them. So that's where that detail came from. But you know, at the time I was just thinking, oh, I'll just put this in here for now, it's fine. And then as I started researching more about the practice of calligraphy, I realized that the philosophy behind it, and there are many different schools of thought and training, but it was so parallel to kind of the journey that Daiyu was going on, which was a question of how do I become my own person? How do I take agency for myself and make it in this world? And in calligraphy, one of the main things is, you know, no matter what, you have to kind of be a good person inside in order to create any sort of good art on the outside. And that, you know, and when I happened upon that, I realized there's no way to write about her practicing calligraphy without also integrating this very vital philosophy that will be kind of the basis for how she goes through the world. So that was the kind of research and integration portion. I think I just got very lucky. Like it was very easy to bring it in because it so matched what I was trying to do with the character in the story. As far as the business side of things, also the easiest thing in the world to incorporate the Chinese characters, you know, and I also don't italicize the pinyin in this book when some characters are speaking Chinese and they're moving in and out of English. My editor was amazing, Carolyn Blakey at Flatiron. She never had any questions about it. She, you know, fully trusted that this was what I wanted to do and it was the right thing to do. And I truly, you know, it's so funny that you asked about it because it was the last thing on my list of anything that I needed to address with the publisher.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that so much because I think particularly for folks of color, and anyone who holds any type of marginalization, especially in publishing, we hear these horror stories of how difficult it is to advocate for the things that you know are right for your community. And I also love to hear those stories where it's like, well, if you find the right people, right, then these issues are they're fabricated, right? Because
Yeah.
when you have the right people, they're not issues.
They understand what you're trying to do and who you're writing for.
Yeah. No, I love that. And so I want to get back on this topic of agency, because agency is not always a weapon for good. Okay. And I think that, anytime we talk about women, or, a young girl in this case, like seeking and developing her own agency, we assume that it's going to be used for good, right? Break those glass ceilings, girl power, all that kind of stuff. I think we can see this with what's going on in Italy right now. You're like, oh yeah, a woman is a leader of this country, but politics are a little sketch, right? So there are a lot of young girls and women in the book who do make very strong hashtag girl power choices for themselves that are harmful for Daiyu, right? And I think a really good example of this is, I want to speak to the brothel manager, Madam Lee, who I read in the author's note is based on, Atoy. Please tell me if I'm mispronouncing that. Who, according to Wikipedia, was like the most famous, first and highest paid Chinese sex worker in San Francisco. And so, what was it like for you to discover like Atoy's story in your research process, and how you made a decision around portraying women who would not actually be supportive of Daiyu, right? In their search for their own agency, compromise the agency of other girls.
Yeah. I think, as I was kind of starting out doing research for this book, a lot of it was based around, the anti-Chinese violence that occurred at the time in many, many instances. And so you kind of go into it from the lens of, like many Chinese folks didn't have a lot of agency at that time. But what was interesting, especially when I was looking into the brothel stuff and found Atoy, was that you're right, like there were some women who did hold certain degrees of power and certain degrees of agency. And you could argue, that wasn't true agency because they're still operating under, systems of oppression. But finding that, I wanted to include it in the book because I didn't want the book to just paint this narrative that the Chinese were helpless and always kind of in despair. No, like they had some stake in their lives and in the world, and the brothel scenes were kind of a portion of that. What was the second part of your question, Jodi?
Yeah, no, sorry, I like asked too many questions at once. But like when you saw her story, like I think you're answering it right. Like the decision to like kind of bring her into the fold of the story. And I just thought it was important for me that Daiyu wasn't just surrounded by, she's a vulnerable girl, so she is surrounded by men that could create harms, for her and in her life. But there are also women who, not every woman you come across is going to be nurturing and trying to save you from kind of this thing that's happening to you. And I think that, at least for me as a reader, raised the stakes of, Daiyu really has to find herself in this process, because the people that you would think would be in her corner are not there.
Exactly. It has to come from within. And maybe that's kind of where, talking about Lin Daiyu going in and coming out of her, that was also maybe a metaphor for finding that strength from within rather than relying on the people around you. Because what ends up happening for her is she gets betrayed many a time by people that she trusts. And it takes a lot for her to end up learning how to trust again in the second half of the book.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think related to that trusting and the sense of agency, I think for folks who have like content related questions, feel free to put those in the chat before we go on into some of the like writing process and writing life type questions. But I wanted to talk about the cover, and I did not realize this until we talked about this. So I'm specifically talking about the US hardcover cover. As I learn more about the world of publishing, like the UK has a different cover, maybe the paperback might have a different cover. So this is the cover I'm talking about. And so when we were discussing it, I immediately thought, because you're like, the wave, like what is this figure? And I don't know for people like what you saw when you saw this arrangement of colors, but for me it didn't even really register, right? And so I've been thinking about it, you know, as we talk about calligraphy, like a ink block test, or like the Rorschach test,
Yeah.
right? These optical illusions of like, what do you see, right? Do you see the young woman or do you see the old lady? Like those images, people are familiar with it. And so I think when I first saw it, I saw water. Like I saw something natural, and I think my brain was conditioned to see that because sky is in the title of the book, right? So I was just like, oh, okay, cool, something environmental. And then when we were chatting, or at least when I got a little ways into the book, I think probably past the section that you read, and I was so deeply involved in Daiyu, I looked at the cover again, and then that's when I saw the face.
Yeah.
And so it became this test of like, do you see the person or do you see the thing that happened to them, right? Do you see Daiyu, or do you see these like milestones of her life? Kidnap, check. Smuggled across in a barrel across the ocean, check. Brothel, check, right? And so I just, and it particularly for women of color, this idea of that we have interior worlds, right? When you think about this one sentence that was in a New York, I looked up from 1885, New York Times, it's one sentence, right? About these men who were lynched, right? To create the interior world of these characters who have thoughts and feelings and hobbies and things that excite them, and, you know, bad friendship habits of not telling each other things that you should tell each other, you know? And so could you speak about that process of how do you actually build the interior worlds of people that don't exist?
That's a great question. I'll speak for at least the building of Daiyu, because I think that's the one where I was like, this is the most interior I'll ever be. But it started from that little nugget of research. And it kind of just went from, okay, imagining her in this bucket of coal, imagining what it must have felt like to be crammed in a bucket of coal for 3 weeks, bobbing along the ocean. What that must have felt like for her legs, you know, the delirium she must have experienced, all that, and then kind of like stepping out and imagining what must have happened to lead her to this point. Yeah, I think for me, I naturally, because I come from a nonfiction background, you know, I write a lot of personal essays. Interiority is something that just it feels very natural for me to explore and put on the page, because I'm constantly exploring what's going on in here. And so when I took over Daiyu's voice from the first person perspective, it was kind of like stepping into her and living in her for a little bit and going through the motions with her. And in that way, you know, I was thinking about, what is she noticing when she's standing on the steps of a calligraphy school? What does, you know, a dumpling feel like in her belly? What does like the concept of love feel like for someone who's never experienced it in a non-platonic way before? I think like in terms of writing interiority and imagining interiority for these characters, I really had to kind of close my eyes and just place and think about everything that they're seeing and everything that they're feeling, and kind of zero in on the things that progress their journey, whether, you know, it's in the plot or it's their spiritual journey.
Yeah. And I think you do it so well. I was chatting with another writer friend of mine about how you describe the things that you're experiencing and how complex the translation of those senses are. There's this one sentence that you have where you describe the fish market. I think you say it smells wet and damp. And I loved that so much because wet and damp are not smells. But I read it and I'm like, I know exactly what that means. And because I think that's how we experience the world, right? Yeah. It's some combination of senses where something can smell wet, right? It can smell damp, and that it just fills in so much for the reader. So the book is filled with these such sensory moments where I can feel you in their worlds. I'm curious if there's a character in the book that if you or someone were to write them as the protagonist in another book, right? Like, who would you choose? I guess I'm still asking, like, which character are you still curious about that you would want to say, like, okay, what could 400 pages look like in this person's world?
Oh, I love that question. That's a great question. I think Swallow. I'm really interested in Swallow, and like clearly Daiyu is also interested in Swallow as well. But yeah, for those who haven't read it, she's one of the girls in the brothel who Daiyu becomes close with, and they develop a sort of friendship. But yeah, I want to know more about her because she's in a very interesting position in the ranks of the brothel. And maybe also Nelson. I love Nelson. I have a soft spot for him. So those would be my two.
I have feelings about Nelson. I imagine, like, if this were to turn into like a Apple TV or Hulu series or something, that the first time Nelson comes in the door, there's just like the wind's blowing in his hair or whatever.
Music starts playing, slow down, slow motion.
Slow motion with like Daiyu's eyes just looking at him. When he came in the room, I was like, girl, you in love, child. You are in love. Okay. All right. We're gonna go into a little bit of the writing process. This is the smallest, silliest question, but I have to ask you this. Like, I noticed that all the dialogue is not bracketed with quotations. And I noticed that, and I was so excited by that I stopped reading so I could Google like this as a style. And so I'm curious, like, about your choice or how it came to be around choosing not to bracket dialogue.
Yeah, it's a very controversial topic based on what I've seen in terms of reviewers and people's reactions to it. But for me, it was always just, I'm a very like feelings-oriented writer. So if something doesn't feel right, then I follow that. But for me, yeah, when I put quotation marks in it, it didn't feel right. It didn't look right, and it didn't feel right when I was reading it to myself. And I think maybe partially that's because so much of this book is Daiyu, her thoughts and what she's seeing in the world are kind of interchangeable. Like you never know if she's telling you a story, if she's just kind of telling herself or experiencing something. So I think it works by not having the quotation marks in aiding that continued sort of interchange.
I felt that actually, because there were some moments where I'm like, is she recounting this story like very Titanic style, where the whole movie is someone telling the story to someone else, right? Yeah. Or are these her thoughts? Like, but I loved it. Like, I loved the absence of the quotation marks. I felt more grounded in kind of what you were saying in the full experience. So I did notice that I had to Google. I'm like, what is this about? Because I'm into it. Like, okay. Another technical question. How did you deal with the overwhelm of research that went into this book? Like, practically, how do you organize it? And I'm also curious, like, what of that is still on the cutting room floor somewhere that just didn't make sense to put in the story? Like, how do you deal with the amount of research that you did?
Oh, it was a lot of research. But what's interesting is when I look back on it, it never got to a point where it felt overwhelming. And I think that's because my method for writing this book was for the first few drafts, I was thinking, Jenny, just get through the story, just finish the story. Anytime I've reached a place where I knew, I need to research this, or I need research to inform this, I would just kind of put brackets around it as a note for myself, come back later to this. So in those first few drafts, I only did as much research as was necessary to kind of be able to move on to the next scene, so that I could get through to the end. And then with each revision, with each draft, I would come back in and layer in more research. So it was like I never did research in one fell swoop and then said, okay, I'm taking all of this and I'm just going to somehow distribute it into my book. It was one draft done. I would research one particular aspect, maybe focusing on like the brothel system or, the joss houses or the temples or the tong system or what fashion was like back then. And I would just layer it in with each draft until in the end, it was like there were no more windows or holes. It was all filled in. Practically, I use Scrivener when I'm drafting, and Scrivener has a research function within it where you can just drop in all of your research, and you can reference it at the same time as you're writing. So for me, I would create categories and just drop in any sort of research I found, citations included, and it made it easy for me to be like, okay, I'm writing a scene where they're eating food. Oh, okay, I'll go to my food tab and see how much did food cost that day or back then? What were the typical menu items of the time? And so I kind of organized it in a way that made it easier for me to reference it quickly.
I love that. And it's also a lot of shade to me because I've been writing one chapter of my book for like a month because I won't move on. And so I think for all the writers in the room, this idea of bracketing and not getting overwhelmed with the information is really critical. So if my editor is watching this, I promise I will take the tips from Jenny and move on.
Just to get to the end, because you can always come back to it.
I think I forget that sometimes because it's like I can't move forward if this isn't right. And that's not true because it's a computer. I'm not chiseling, right? My ideas, right? So on the writing process, like who were some of your early readers and like at what stage of the development did you bring other people into your process?
Yeah, my first reader was my mom. She's always my first reader, and she's a good litmus test for like the emotionality of the story, but also the level, if the prose is doing what I want it to do. And then I had one of my best friends read it, who's also Chinese American, and mainly I just wanted to get her take on kind of the Chinese American experience in this book and whether or not she felt like it resonated and felt accurate. Those were probably my two initial first readers. And then once I got to a stage where I had a full draft that I felt good about, I sent it to about 6 people. And they were my writing community, folks from previous workshops and retreats and my MFA program that I had done. But it was mom and best friend in the beginning.
Oh my God. I love that. I love that so much. I have a couple of readers, but I'm like so terrified of sending them anything. So I think it's helpful to like, maybe there's 1 or 2 people in the beginning, people that you really trust, and then you can bring more eyes in as you feel more secure in like what it is that you're writing.
Yeah, I think I took a novel writing workshop with Allison Hagee, which is where this book came from. But I remember she was always so protective because we were just writing the first 20 pages, the first 40 pages, and we were workshopping them. And she was always so protective of people who were being workshopped because it's so easy when you're in those beginning stages to hear feedback from someone and think, this is how I need to alter the book. And sometimes I feel like you just need to be alone with it and spend time with it by yourself so that you know what it is before you let other people in.
Yeah. I've been realizing that too. It's like asking people for feedback, but on ideas, but they're not responding to something that like actually exists yet,
Yeah.
How did you cope with like mentally, emotionally, and also logistically with the lost pages, right? All the ideas and the drafts that just sit in your computer somewhere.
Yeah, so I know I mentioned this to you last time, but I started this book writing from Nelson's perspective, who is the
Mm.
character we meet in the second half of the book. I had like 70 to 120 pages of him. And, once I started writing from Daiyu's perspective, and my agent had looked at it and she agreed, like, get rid of the Nelson portions. This is not a story about him. So those pages are truly lost to the ether. I still have them, but they're never going to see the light of day. I was fine saying goodbye to them because once I found Daiyu's voice, it was like, this is what I care about most. Nelson, I'm sorry to you. You are so handsome, but you have
So
no
handsome.
business here. You have no business here anymore. I was not, weirdly, and I'm a very sentimental person. I was not sentimental about cutting things because each time I did it, it made the story better, and I I just trusted that that was the right thing to do.
I wonder what the mental purpose is, because I have like a separate document for every chapter that's
Yeah.
like outline or scraps for this document. And so the chapter I'm working on now is like 5 pages, but my scraps document is 52 pages long.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
And I don't know why I need to have it, because it's not like I look at it again. It just
Yeah.
exists.
Just to have, I do the same thing. Like mine is called Orphans because, like maybe one day I'll use them again. That's the thing. I never go back and copy paste and bring it back into the main document. I
Yeah.
never have.
Yeah. So where's been your favorite places to write?
Oh, before the pandemic, it was in coffee shops around Austin, particularly when the weather is not so blazing hot outside. I could sit outside and write with a little croissant or something. But since the pandemic, I just write in at home. I just
Yeah.
alternate between my desk, which is where I am now, and my couch, and sometimes my bed. It's just a matter of like which surface do I want to sit on today.
And do you
Yeah.
have like a writing or like an ideal writing routine? And then how far is that from your reality?
My ideal writing routine is probably one where I get to read like other people's work for a good bit before I get to my own writing. And ideally, like I will not have done any other thing in the day that requires brain activity. So it's like words and writing and creation and generation are the first things of my day.
Yeah.
But that is not my reality. I don't know if it can be many people's reality. So what it actually is I do all this stuff and then at like 3 p.m. I'm like, okay, Jenny, just get to the desk. Just go there. Open that laptop up. You can do it.
No, that makes me feel better too, because I went to this workshop. For anyone who's watching, listening, who follows Roxanne Gay and Tressie McMillan Cotton, they have like Hair to Slay. They had a Hair to Slay camp retreat thing, Slay Camp, and Tressie, who talks about and writes about the fact that so many Black women, so many, I think in general, like thinkers and creators of color don't get to just have one job, right? We have so many different jobs. And so she was describing her writing routine, and she doesn't actually start writing until 6:30 p.m. And I'm like, okay, that vibes with me, because I end up writing like later in the day, but I'm also feeling bad that I didn't start writing at 5 o'clock in the morning. In any case, I'm curious because you have a job, right? You have a things that you have to do outside of writing. And so what does that mean for your life to have this identity as a writer, have the work as a published author, and also have a day job?
Yeah, I think for me at least, knowing that I have this other life as a writer, it makes everything else that I have to do in order to survive bearable. And it almost makes me excited to return to the writing every single time because I know that it's not currently, at least, it's not the only thing in my life, but it is the most important and the most pleasurable thing in my life.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. So when it comes to the business of writing, again, like it's not just another job, it's your identity as a writer, but also comes with work, right? People that you're accountable to.
Yeah.
Is there anything that surprised you around like the business of writing or being a published author that you could give advice for people that are navigating this in some way?
Yeah. This is less so about the business and more so maybe about the spiritual. But I realized, it can be very jarring when you're going from being the only person in the room working on your book, being so close to it and having everything just like live within yourself, to suddenly having this like product that, people can now have opinions and reactions to. It no longer kind of belongs to you. It has to kind of stand on its own without you supporting it, like parenthood, I suppose. And that jump can be very jarring. At least it was for me. And it can like lead to questions around who you are as a writer and your relationship to writing. I would just say, try to keep, no matter where you are in your writing journey or the publication process, try to keep the joy of writing and like remember why you're doing this at all. And remember, for me, it's like remembering when I was a child and writing and it was fun and I wanted to do it. Remembering that feeling and holding that onto that, even when you're at a place where it's like, maybe I don't have a good relationship with writing right now. Trying to keep that joy alive, I think.
No, I love that because like there's some days I go to the page and I'm like, how you feel about this doesn't matter. This is a job, like get it done. And then there are other days where it's like you should be joyous, you should be happy, like you want that to read on the page. Like how cool is it that you could just create something that doesn't exist, right? How can I
Right.
find the fun and the beauty and joy in the art? And every day I go back and forth of like, is this art? Is this a job? Is it both? What? you know? So it's just weird. So I think in speaking to the joy, I'm curious for you. These are my last two questions. What's your favorite part of the book? Like what of this book like is bringing you joy?
Oh, it's those small moments that where Daiyu gets to experience joy too. One of those, I mean, the brothel scenes, I loved writing those because I loved kind of having her interact with other women. But I think my favorite, like the most joyful part was when she's in Idaho and she's kind of goofing off with Nelson in the store and they're trying to teach each other Chinese, or she's trying to teach him Chinese. That like small moment of joy where she just gets to be a young person interacting with another young person. I was so happy reading that.
I love, and I think those are the moments too where she inhabits a bit more fullness of herself, because there are a lot of times where you note that she forgets that she's hiding a lot about who she is. And so it was nice to just see like she's just like having fun with her friend.
Yeah.
Her friend, wink wink.
Her friend.
So last question, I'm curious, like what do you need from your writing? And what do you think your writing needs from you?
I think what I need from my writing is for it to do like all the things that great literature does for me, which is like move someone and make them, feel close to something or resonate with them or speak to their experiences, and also like be good. I want it to be good. And I need it to, I think I need it to also kind of be a way of expressing myself, in whatever shape or form that is. Be kind of true to what I want to do as a writer and an artist, and who I want to be as an artist. What my writing needs from me is probably the same thing I need from me, which is care and grace and patience and time and attention. all the things that get pushed aside when we're, we talked about this, doing everything else instead of taking care of ourselves. I think my writing also needs all of that from me. Just love. It needs love from
It
me.
needs love. It
Yeah.
needs love.
We all need love.
We do all need love, and I think we all need this book, right? Absolutely. I think everyone who's watching this, I think you'll be a better person having read this. I really do think that. And I so appreciate you, and I so appreciate this work. And I don't want to say that I'm excited about what you have to come next, because I want to get outside of this capitalistic mindset that you're always producing. But I'm really excited for the fact that this lives in the world now, and can create something for somebody in some way. So thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you. And these questions were amazing, by the way. Amazing questions.
Thank you. That's what we do here at the Lit Lounge. And so for everyone, thank you, Jenny. Thank you to One Kin. Thank you for everyone who's watching. And thank you. Please tell 5 people to get this book. Bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.